Hi everyone. Raghu and I were just going to take the opportunity to cover one of the topics we didn't cover off on in Friday's risk briefing in Bangkok due to the time limitations. And that is basically the challenge of Chinese expansionism amid Trump era tariffs. We're going to drill in on some particular issues we think clients need to be aware of. But Raghu, if you could just give a little bit of a big picture and then we'll go about drilling in and making clients aware of some of the key things to monitor and some of the key potential issues that will affect them.
Sure, Paul. So, as Trump has been elected, there is a lot of talk of the tariffs that he's spoken about. There is a complex interplay between this Trump era tariffs that we are looking at and China's strategic response to this. Trump has pledged to implement substantial tariffs on imports from China at almost about 60%. And he's also claimed that he will impose tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada, as well as general tariffs on all imports. That is notwithstanding some negotiations that will be held, which would potentially, in Trump's idea, be favorable for both parties. Now, China has looked at this, and there has been an escalation of the trade tensions, and we're looking at China already implementing certain export restrictions, like on critical minerals. They're apparently doing currency policy adjustments to make sure that they would probably weaken the yuan as a strategy to offset the impacts of tariffs. And its reports also indicate that China is diversifying into export markets. So, generally speaking, we're looking at heightened trade tensions between the great powers, the US and China.
And look, I mean, just last week, the US Trade Representative Catherine Tai announced 50% tariffs on solar wafers and polysilicon and a 25% tariff on certain tungsten products. And of course, these components are essential for manufacturing solar panels and semiconductors. Interestingly, very important to note, I think, for clients that conversely, China recently tested the market and issued $2 billion US dollars worth of denominated sovereign bonds, but instead of doing it in a major financial center, they did it in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And that offering was massively oversubscribed, like 20 times. And the normal oversubscription when America offers bonds is about 3 times. So it shows that people are prepared to buy US dollars via a conduit, in this case, China. Interestingly, to do it in an area where it's a traditional stronghold and the petrodollar was all set up with Saudi. So it's bowled both by not only the Chinese, but by the Saudis. And it was so small a difference, 0.02 of a percent is the difference between buying direct from America. So, so what? Well, it says a strong message that if you're going to go down the tariff path, if you're not going to go down fair trade and free markets and normal capitalism, if you're going to be self-serving, we can also play games. Now, $2 billion, no big deal. But if the offering shows that 2 could easily have been 20 and it would have been taken. So if you imagine $100 billion, then it starts to become a major issue. And especially at a time when the US is trying to issue bonds to serve its own debt. So I think China's demonstrating already that it can operate as an alternative manager of dollar liquidity, and they've also done that right in the heart of the petrodollar system. Fundamentally, what they're saying is we can compete against the USA on where, how, and with who, and who has access to the funds. And whilst China, you could argue, I mean, it's almost a given, has too many US dollars. So why are they doing this? Because the strategy helps, BRICS countries serve their debt to America. And China's basically saying, hey, look, we're actually going to cut a deal here. You can pay us back in yuan. You can pay us in rare earth minerals. You can give us geostrategic space. bought and cut deals with us on energy supply. So it's a fairly, very notable, interesting strategic move. And of course, while the US prints the dollars, China can basically say, well, we're going to decide where that money flows. If America intervenes, it also shows that the US dollar is politicised and stresses that it be made, and further stresses that maybe BRICS members need to move away and take the risk to move away from USD control rugger. So I think that's a very bold move by China, but it's really at this stage just sending a signal that this isn't going to go all your way. You've been manipulating markets, giving reasons on, using security as reasons. But it's really about domestic politics. It's about maintaining America's hegemonic power. And what I didn't note there is the amount of debt that America's covering is a really key issue in this particular strategic message from China.
Right. And Paul, at this point, in your view, what do you see in terms of the tit-for-tat protectionism that's happening between China and the US? Because arguably, this also hurts US consumers. It's also causing inflationary pressures domestically in the US, and the rest of the world and the markets and businesses are impacted. So, who do you see as the beneficiary of these trade tensions?
Look, that's a really interesting question, Rugger, because on the short term, it's difficult to see what is real and what is Trump just trying to build on his popularism. Just like we discussed in Indonesia with Prabowo economics, we've got the Trump economics era now, and that's really basically hip shooting. It's not really solid and easy policy you can read. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes when he comes further down the path of his presidency. I think the reality is you can't do what he's proposing without further costs. So it's popular amongst Republican voters, but it's not sound economics. So clearly, China is going to have an advantage on production. He's trying to take that advantage away. I mean, that's the obvious call. But the reality is that if they're trying to generate manufacturing to compete domestically in America, you're winding back the economic progress path, 4 or 5 decades. So ultimately, it's going to hurt his reputation. It's going to hurt his party, and it's going to satisfy, his short-term popularity. But I think it's going to be ultimately a very interesting strategic battle. China's already been able to find other markets and prove that it can pivot extremely well. America's, the growth of BRICS, the power in the growth of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and many other multilateral and regional entities says people are nations are fed up, leaders are fed up, and we're seeing changes of government because of that. France is teetering. They've had a change of PM. The president may be next. Germany's changed governments. Of course, you've got a strongman in Turkey, a strongman in Italy. The Ukraine war might be going America's way in terms of helping prevent an opposition to the hegemonic power in terms of weakening Russia. But it could also throw on top of BRICS and on top of the SCO, perhaps some of the European nations are going, hey, you know what, this may be a dangerous partnership for us. I think China, we have to consider a snapshot of economics at this point. And if we just look at the most basic of data, you've got the USA versus China, GDP on a nominal basis, straight US dollar basis. The USA is at about 30 trillion, significantly bigger than China at 18 trillion. But if you look at it on a purchasing power parity basis, USA's at 28 trillion. China's significantly higher, in fact, 25% higher at 35 trillion, meaning their money, because they've got lower costs of living, is much higher. You've then got economic growth in America sitting at probably 2.7, 2.8% versus China at 4.8%. The big unknowns, however, are unknown debts in China. So we know how much debt America's got, and it's significant, around about 100% of their GDP. We don't know China's. And people tend to think, well, that's because you've got so much debt, they don't want the world to know. Is it? Or is it a strategic move on their behalf? So the tariff effects are a big gamble by the states. And, those above figures and the discussions we've had give relevance that the rare earth mineral supply, the technical chip production, especially with AI and other technologies increasing the need for these high-speed chips, that this debt element's going to become critical, hence China's message that, hey, we're going to play with your bond market. And they're big enough now not to be pushed around. And my great concern for the American state, where everybody needs their values as a global ombudsman, but they need to be very careful about all the wars they're funding and helping out friends on the other side of the world. I'm sure they've got their reasons for that, but their debt is going to suffer greatly. There seems to be no plan to get that under control. And you wouldn't, people talk about great economic manager because he owns businesses. Trump's had massive debt problems, insolvency issues, hardly the track record to manage the world's biggest economy, and he's a popularist and he shoots from the hips. So there's going to be some very interesting issues coming out, and who is going to be controlling the USA policies. I hope I answered your question there, Rugger, in a roundabout sort of way.
Yes, Paul, you did. And understandably, these sort of developments cause a lot of jitters for businesses, and we do hear of reports where MNCs have begun to reassess their sourcing and manufacturing strategies. For example, the iPhone has sort of the production has moved to India and Vietnam to hedge against the geopolitical risks. So the big question is, people talk about economic decoupling or the decoupling from China. Is that a realistic solution for what's going on?
Look, I think what we need to be really cognizant of is decoupling from China in terms of the USA domestic economy. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, Paul. Decoupling in terms of supply chain, decoupling in terms of the economy, just being the production lines being so entrenched in China.
Yeah, look, and I think the reality of that is there's a lot of countries out there that think ESG is a wonderful thing for the states and the developed countries, but it's also another controlling mechanism. I think Dan Bowman covered off that really well last week when he was talking about Indonesia. And I think what people are failing to understand is that some of these partnerships that China's actively in are so large that as America decouples from China, China's got an incredible opportunity, an incredible reputation to partner because it isn't dialectic. It's not going, I love you, Israel, I'm going to send heaps of money, I'm going to blow the smithereens, anything else, and we're good with that. Sorry, Ukraine, quote, you're going to fight until the last Ukrainian, and I don't think they meant it as directly as their military battles are proving. But if you look at the regional partnerships and the global partnerships that China's involved in, you've got the regional comprehensive economic partnership, where it's locked in with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, amongst others. You've then got the strategic alliances and partnerships, notably BRICS. And I think everyone's pretty familiar with BRICS, but what they're probably not as familiar with is the Asian Infrastructure and Development Organization, and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And if you look at the latter, it's the world's largest regional organization, not only in terms of geographical scope and population. It's covering a quarter of the world's base, and it's 42% of the world's population. So it's the big rig, it's the big deal, it's the big show. And the first one I mentioned, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, It's a multilateral bank, basically set up to compete against the political tool disguised behind the titles World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank. And it's the world's second largest multilateral development institution. It's headquartered in Beijing. It's got 110 members if we include 12 that are currently in the process. And if we break it down by geographical regions, that's very interesting that it's got 42 members in Asia, 26, I think it was, in Europe, 22 in Africa, 10 in Oceania, eight in South America, and even 2 in North America. So I fear, which is often the case, that America and its allies often sit there on a colonial high box and they make decisions based on perhaps a flawed perception that they are still a monolithic giant with superior values, superior economies. I think the reality is China hasn't started the war in Taiwan. China hasn't been drawn in to actively supporting Ukraine. And I think that's masking a strategy that we're going to develop our position as a global leader to compete against American homogeneous power by basically developing relationships. Now, I'm not being naive here. I understand all the downsides of China and its political system and some of its behaviours, most certainly, particularly human rights. But today's not about that. Today's about stressing issues that present the other side seems to be being hidden by the media and hidden by the think tanks that should be running nations and wars and being a little bit more prudent on their long-term planning and considering the impacts of racing into wars on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, racing into Afghanistan for a couple of decades, pulling back out. It's a little bit like that puppet comedy show, Team America. Sometimes you start to think, was that a documentary, right? Anyway, let's pull it up there, Rugger. I think that gives people enough food for thought, enough points to go away and research. I'm certainly not a pro-advocate. Communism is great, China's awesome, but I really want to make sure our clients aren't looking through rose-coloured goggles and thinking the world is like it gets presented on the mainstream media. Thank you, Rugger, for joining us, and thanks for all your inputs.
Thanks, Paul.